I think I should start. So I think the correct thing to do and the customary thing to do here is to thank all of the artists, which is, I think, everyone here apart from myself. Aimée, Lykourgos, Gabriel, Foivos and Phil, and also the organisers of this post-truth conference, Foivos, Phil and Jordan, and our hosts, not Zoom, but the Freud Museum. And I'm just going to say a few words by way of an introduction that will maybe contribute a kind of backdrop to our subsequent discussion. And I want to start by remembering something that T.J. Clarke, the art historian, wrote a while ago now. And this is the quote. "It's hard to tell at present whether ideas of resistance and refusal have any sustaining force still left in them, or have been hopelessly incorporated into a general spectacle." I want to kind of counterpose that against something that David Joselit, I'm never sure about the J there, observed in the aftermath of Trump's victory in 2016, that all news is fake news from someone's point of view, and as a corollary, any conceptual category, such as fake news itself, may be unmoored from its anchoring signification and begin trending as a polysemous slogan. "We are caught," he continues, "in a cacophony of irreconcilable truths, each of which appears to some, in good faith or not, as patently false. But we have lost, it seems, the common ground that others imagined for weighing the virtues of such alternatives." Two phrases from those, ideas of resistance and refusal on the one hand, and on the other, a cacophony of irreconcilable truths. And read together, those two quotes suggest to me that something has been lost on which ideas of resistance and refusal would need to support them, that they would push off from the ground, if you like. And the language that Clarke and Joselit use there gets us towards a certain, in my opinion at least, compatibility or mutuality between the practice of art and the practice and theory of psychoanalysis. Two modes of knowledge making and sharing which are based to certain degrees in dislodging the security and form of truth, that points towards its decentering, dislodging, contesting, or burial, if needs be. Many people would quite legitimately complain that we seem to have lost any sense of shared reality, and that I think this was completely unignorable in the debates which we have thankfully just seen the last of before the 3rd of November, which appears again to many as a casualty of the tools that we use to mediate our experience. Tools which have made what Freud called reality testing to a greater or lesser extent simply unavailable. But there's another term of Freud's that I think is useful for us today, and that's a kind of strange term, psychic reality or subjective reality, the reality that appears to be more real than objective reality or actuality, and yet which kind of cannot be shared or requires certain conditions for it to be negotiated. And I think a lot of art has always been attuned and attentive to the partiality of experience that would comprise psychic reality, and the knowledge claims that any assertion or declaration of truth will inevitably be based on. So I think what matters is definitely how we negotiate truth and reality, the kind of conditions that we need to be freed from what another analyst, Donald Winnicott, called being locked in the fixity of fantasying. And to that extent, I just have some questions which they're not spoken to be answered directly, but they're thoughts that take the form of questions. How can a psychoanalytic account of subjectivity with a concept so radically destabilizing as the unconscious at its center be mobilized to trouble our current condition of epistemological uncertainty? How do the politics of post-truth expand or inhibit art's capacity to reimagine being with others? What psychic resonances in new modes of circulation and remediation do we need to most urgently recognize? And can those tools be turned towards a practice of resistance or refusal? Alternatively, are we better off associating words like resistance and refusal to their psychoanalytic signification as modes of a different, less open form of defense? As I say, they're kind of offered just as a backdrop for what we talk about, and will be of varying degrees of relevance for everyone here. But by way of a more direct question, and I think it's going to start with Foivos and Phil, if you could tell us a little bit more about the Ministry of Post-truth, which clearly has been formative of why we're here today, and if you could explain a little bit about that and its curatorial concerns and the work being done by that contraction post-truth.
Phil, would you like to start?
I'd rather you start, actually, to kind of connect it a little bit better with the conference.
Right. First of all, like the starting point for this kind of discussion was to bring this kind of basically this dialogue between the arts and the whole kind of idea of post-truth forward. So we start like the Ministry of Post-truth as an attempt to basically kind of see how we can talk about post-truth and all these things that happened in the past like 5 years with like Trump coming to power, Brexit, like fascist parties gaining traction in Europe. And we wanted to see like what can art basically and creative kind of media offer to this discussion. So we come from the world of performance. So our work was mostly kind of focusing on performances and performative lectures and stuff like that. So we started that by organizing a series of events. We started doing something in Athens. And then we had this dialogue with the Freud Museum. And I personally, I have a background in psychoanalytic studies. So I was very interested to create this triangle, if you want, where on one hand you have art and whatever, performance and video and stuff like that. On the other hand, you have post-truth. And then we have this third pole that is like psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic thinking. And of course, this triangle is quite a complex triangle. And obviously there are different ways to approach it. And, you know, we kind of try to have things that basically at least touch, you know, two of the sides of this triangle. But basically, what we thought was interesting was like how basically psychoanalysis talks a lot about things that they are adjacent to truth, but they're not about factuality. So you mentioned like psychic truth. Another thing is like the enjoyment and the libidinal aspect of truth, and all these things, and of course like paranoia, and all the different types of illusions that they are like external to objective reality, but have a really big importance within the clinic of the psychoanalytic work. So we were, and just I will stop here because I think I open all kinds of different topics, but like we wanted to see basically how this kind of understanding of truth that comes from psychoanalysis and the understanding of truth that comes from the arts, how can they inform basically people who try to find some sort of like way of political action today, where like, for example, presenting facts is not good enough and is contested. So like, what are the other ways like of intermediality and potentially of understanding like the function of enjoyment and jouissance and all these fancy words, and can these kind of things, can these tools offer some way of understanding truth and politics today that can be actually like politically useful for like progressive politics or for emancipatory politics of some sort.
And I'd like to add something to do with, can you see me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd like to add something to do with the context and the time that the whole idea of the Ministry of Post-truth came together. One could say why such a project started in Athens and at this particular time. Okay, the whole Athens thing, I guess we come from a place that is absolutely drenched in myths. Before you finish school, you are told so many things about what you are or you have been, and about 90% of them are kind of inaccurate. So we, Greeks are one of the most conspiracy-prone people in the world, I think, because of this particular type of schooling that is so much connected to a mythology. And the particular time that this happened, of course, it has to do a lot with, as Foivos said, with the whole post-truth thing coming up, but also it coincided with the existence of the German art fair Documenta in Athens. As probably all of you know, the Documenta art fair, which happens every 5 years, normally happens in Germany, and it's like the biggest case of art in the world, and they decided that they will do it in Athens. And throughout this festival, there was a sense that an answer to the difficulties of our times, which have to do with the, whether it is the refugee crisis or whether it is the, post-truth and the new right and the alt-right and whatever that is a sort of return to a new kind of sincerity in a way. And so a lot of the art that actually happened in the Documenta art fair was very didactic and was very much like taking identity politics and really, really simplifying them just to make sure that we're not saying something that might be problematic in any way. And for us, this was apart from the fact that it was a huge missed opportunity to actually discuss German and Greek myths in this very interesting moment in history. It also felt like a very strange way of dealing with the issue of post-truth and what it can bring to the area of the arts, let's say, or how the arts can deal with that. It was almost like shying away from the problem and pretending that it wasn't happening. It's not happening where we are operating because we are all very moral and we are all very clear with what we want to be saying, almost as if ambiguity suddenly turned into something that was, inherently fascistic, almost as if trolls moved the whole process of what the arts can do into a place where you either have to be very clear about your politics or otherwise you're a potential fascist. And so that was the moment where we experienced some of that, this sort of turn to, I wouldn't say necessarily grand narratives, but almost, let's say, a fear of ambiguity, a fear of all the things that we consider to be extremely interesting in what what art languages can do, that have to do with, over-identification or subversive affirmation and various strategies we have been using or other people have been using, and throw these away in the name of a sort of new sincerity, which to us was just an oversimplification of political discourse. So I just wanted to offer this here because for us it was quite influential in terms of the time that we started this project as a sort of response to what this huge art fair had to say about our times.
I don't want to interrupt people kind of coming back to that and responding to it directly, but I just wanted to very briefly interject, because this is one of the key terms that gets suggested to me by putting by the triangle between art, psychoanalysis, and post-truth that that's been sketched out for us, is a question of intentionality, and to what extent that retains the integrity that it might have, or the significance it might have within an artist practice, and the very different valence of that term in an analytic setting or psychoanalytic setting, whereby one means absolutely everything one says, just not in the way one means what one says. I just because I also think that turns upon again with the kind of discourses that have attended, I think, a lot of digital art since 2016, possibly a little bit longer, have precisely kind of raised the stakes of what certain strategies, such as over-identification, subversive affirmation, there are a number of similar terms that can be used here, what the stakes of strategies like that are. But perhaps we could now turn to Gabriel, and I don't know if you want to respond to what was said just now directly, or if you could talk perhaps a little bit about your work in defense of the academic troll, because I think it speaks to a lot of these questions quite directly.
Maybe a little bit of both, or a little bit of more than both, all three, because I loved Phil's comment about the positioning that now something like trolling requires of practitioners, thinkers, artists, political activists, people in general voicing their opinion. But I wanted to get back to something that I found a bit odd. In the introduction, you mentioned, you related the statement of all news being fake news to David Joselit, whereas I actually remember it from Marshall McLuhan. I mean, there's a video of him saying all news is fake. I don't think he says fake news, but all this to say that these ideas have been around for a while. Joselit basically picked up on that and developed it, took it one step further, as he usually does. So maybe a way to comment on that on my end is to say that also my work in defense of the academic troll, although it was very, very close to the time of the Trump election, and it was developed parallel with the 2016 campaign, but I finished it around May, before fake news was even a word or a neologism, or post-truth for that matter. I mean, there was talk about this, but in the background discourse, here in Germany, nobody heard of trolling until Ieropoulos just jumped in the scene. And so this is also why in the video, there's no mention of neither fake news nor post-truth. And still, I sort of try and describe how the power dynamics, or the dynamics of the formation of knowledge and truth, come to be in that video, because I guess I had a hunch that this is where we're going. And I was advocating for this understanding of the dynamic as something that could be constructive also to academia, because academia has this tendency to discuss the performativity of everything but itself, especially on the poetics and let's say dramaturgical sides of it. Of course, you have in science and technology studies, you have Karen Barad and you have Bruno Latour, and you have all of them talking about the performance of the scientist in the lab. But positioning theory and stuff that came about recently in those sociology departments is pretty recent. Whereas I think artists are invested in these questions since, since a while at least, okay? And I think that what is happening right now, 4 years forward, also with the advent of mass emergence of artistic research programs in the universities, and this acknowledgement of the universities that we need this type of creative thinking just to understand how knowledge is created. Whether we like it or not, we need to involve and include this discourse in our institutes. I think what happened was that post-truth pushed art to the fore. It brought it out of the gallery, for better or worse, and it made it into a viable mindset for forming and inventing methodologies. The irony is that these methodologies have been adopted both by the right and the left. That's the moment when we were scared. We were thinking, hey, Anonymous do a great job, 2011 in trolling power, but suddenly a character like Milo stepped in the scene and, oh shit, what do we do now? They've hijacked that from us, and you can see this all over. But this is the way that fascism always worked, right? I mean, it would always take from the left and implement. So maybe, but maybe one last comment about what art does in this discourse about knowledge in the context of this particular conference. Maybe a nice way to phrase it is that art demands us to confront the unconscious of collective knowledge. It just forces us to admit that we can't call a spade, that it's more complicated than that. And I think now we've just, for better or worse, internalized it on a massive scale. I'll end it at that right now. Thanks.
Aimée, you were nodding along to much of what was said there, so I don't know if you want to say something.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that works really well with thoughts that I've been having, or some of the work that I've been doing. Again, this is a kind of scattered work. In my case, it's not really multimedia work. Well, it is. I mean, it's a performance work that usually is centered around poetry. And then I was going to talk a little bit about the album that I produced with Phil and performed several times in Greece, called Leaky in Saigon. And I can talk about that, but I'll kind of spiral around the subject. This is really interesting. I mean, I took tons of notes. I'll try to kind of put things into words. I think this statement about looking at what's collectively repressed, collective knowledge and what's collectively repressed, I think is key. I think that's exactly the question, because once you remove, as a lot of these discourses do, these sort of post-truth supposedly discourses do, they remove a kind of barrier of authority, which again, I think Gabriel's completely right, has been like the traditional procedure of the left, right? There has been like a way of, in which that's typically been the purview of the left and of academic discourses to kind of, say, let's look behind the curtain and see what's actually going on. Once you kind of remove this barrier to discourse, what you then are still confronted with is the fact that there are still a lot of repressions, social, cultural repressions that haven't been dealt with, right? So there's missing pieces in our collective and cultural knowledge base. And maybe I can talk about this with regard to the Leaky piece, because I think for me, it was an interesting confrontation with things that have been repressed for me as like a cultural subject. So that piece began from like a post-truth basis, which was, the idea was there's this Greek pop star, Leaky Piece, and the idea was that we were going to present her work in a Vietnamese translation and accompany it with the idea that these songs had been translated from Greek, famous Greek pop songs into Vietnamese, and that somehow this had actually happened historically, or there had been some kind of overlap there. What I immediately came up against, there were like multiple layers of things that I came up against. One was the question of why that kind of procedure had not occurred to me, or hadn't taken place in the existing art scene that I was a part of in the US. And the reason was very obvious, that it would be seen as like a craft failure, I think. That even if it was that even if there was like some way to figure out why this could be important for society, I think it would just be seen, you know, it could be seen as trivializing, but like potentially from multiple directions. And unless you could really prove that the translations were somehow themselves so transcendently beautiful and lyric in their own right, the question of it as a kind of cultural performance, you know, like why Greece, why Vietnam, what's the connection? You know, those are the first questions that someone would ask you if you're in a workshopping this piece. And we would have to be like, well, they're Greek, you know, I have a Vietnamese background, so we thought it would be funny. You know, and it just falls apart immediately. But what I found out as we continued to kind of pursue this process was first of all, it's a really useful translation exercise for me. It drew me much more deeply into contact with Vietnamese history, with my own failures to speak Vietnamese language properly. So in a practical way, it drew me closer to contemporary Vietnam and also Vietnam in the 60s and 70s as a source. And then I would say the second half of the procedure was that I ended up realizing in presenting the material that actually there was a lot of similarity in ways that I didn't expect between the history of Greece and the history of Vietnam in the 20th century, which has everything to do with the Second World War. It has to do with different histories of communism and fascism and so on. And actually that there are a lot of not parallels, you know, but moments where we're part of the same international flows of power, different ways in which certain years like 1944 ended up being quite important. And so I did a subsequent piece at last year's Festival of Queer Performance called Vague Wave, which was about 1944 and some of the after effects of that. And strangely enough, there was another piece that related exactly to the subject matter completely by accident, but there was an interesting way in which what we were really doing by taking this arbitrary or silly or like almost excluded, I mean, I could say like an excluded type of production, like an excluded way of working with material, is actually, it seemed to draw us much closer to the currents of what had really happened historically. So I think in a way it's quite a psychoanalytic procedure to try to take something that seems to be essentially the excluded, like the non-art in this sense. And maybe this is more salient in poetry, like the presence of the things that are poetry and then the things that are the non-poetry, to go closer to the things that are the non-poetry, or that would somehow seem like a failed piece of art in various different ways, whether it's insensitive, whether it's got a craft failure, whether there's no basis for it. And somehow those are the exact topics that we need to pursue, I think, and that speaks exactly to what Gabriel was saying about what's culturally repressed. Because I think, to return to the political question, I don't think we can get closer to the political questions of the 20th and 21st centuries without thinking about those things as potentially being exclusions of form in some way. There's things that we've been potentially even trained to see as like ways of making connections that are tacky, or, you know, and that's like something that that again, the right doesn't have that much to work with. All they have to work with is this exact gesture towards the unconscious to say, you already know this, because we're saturated with, you know, right-wing imagery and ideas all the time, to say, you know, you already know. There's no work that has to go into it. You just have to peel back, you know, the whatever it is, the mask or something, and what's left will be your natural kind of right-wing inclination. We on the left have a lot more challenges in terms of like, we have to come up with procedures to access that knowledge. We have to almost generate that knowledge, or kind of recombine it, or you know, look for the fractures. And so I think it's even more important for us to pursue these kinds of practices. And that's kind of where I'll stop for now.
It struck me, at least, that there were kind of several themes or terms which I think would link, I think, quite nicely to Lykourgos's project about the Cthulhu, and especially this idea of well, connectivity is something that came out in various different ways through what you were saying, Aimée, and it struck me that I mean, connectivity is demonstrated and figurized and present in a number of different ways in both the paintings and the videos and the video Lykourgos of that Cthulhu project. And I wonder if you could maybe push off from there in a certain way. One thing, small question that I'm quite curious about is that I think one of the few psychoanalytic texts to have kind of really retained resonance within digital discourses is probably the Schreber case, which obviously wasn't Freud's, but it was something that he took up and it's been taken up by so many other people since. But it's still one of the things that I don't know how it got into digital discourses almost by stealth. But I just wondered whether that was something that that had been in your mind or was in any way a reference point for the Cthulhu project.
I think it's mostly what Gabriel mentioned before of the right wings adopting like left-wing tactics in order to do the propaganda, and then mostly the project is connected to taking all the right-wing conspiracy theories and finding new ways to understand them and also like subversively sort of affirm them. But I didn't really get the question with the connection with the psychoanalytic aspect of the project.
Maybe if you could recap the particular case that you were referring to.
I'm like, no, okay, for an example, in this project, like
I was referring to Ivan because
general conspiracy theories about, for an example, chemtrails and etc. And talking about trolling and sort of like reclaiming or appropriating trolling from the right wing that is taken from left practices and reclaim it again, or sort of affirming and what you call it, challenging this theory of the right wing saying that left wings wants to demasculine us, to degenerate us, and like, yeah, that's perfect.
Pardon, that was rude of me. I understood what you were saying from the get-go when you said it the first time. I was actually referring to Ivan, sorry. You mentioned a particular case by that wasn't related to Freud, and I think that was part of the question that you directed to Lykourgos, and that's why I also wasn't sure what you were talking about. So if you could recap that, maybe we'd have a better understanding of the questions.
Sorry, the Schreber case, the Daniel Paul Schreber, the son of the German jurist who, at the beginning of the 19th century, published diaries that he'd written through his illness, and Freud took them up as an explication of paranoia and paranoid thought structures. And there's a scene in it which also reminded me of a moment in your video as well, Gabriel, to do with the Trinity and the role of his father. But the case has been taken up by Deleuze and Guattari, by Wendy Chun, by so many other people writing about connectivity in discourses which the digital is more familiar with, precisely on that correspondence between paranoid thought structures and digital infrastructures, and how things move around between them. So I just wondered, in terms of the composition of some of those paintings, whether that was in any way a source.
Yeah, no, the source of let's say, inspiration for the paintings. It was digital imagery produced by, again, like right wings and all these cheesy, you know, saint pictures. I don't know if this is a tradition. Maybe that's coming mostly from a Greek tradition of religious memes with religious pictures and saying good morning and have a nice week with a lot of colors. Yeah, that's the inspiration for the paintings imagery, like cheesy postcards, tourist card postals, etc.
Sure.
I think, but in terms of like how Freud talks about like, you know, this kind of delusions like Schreber's, there seems like for Freud, it's really exciting that there is this like organized kind of system of ideas. And I feel like it's really obviously, it's something you can see in conspiracy theories, that they are completely mad, but at the same time, they have this really kind of concrete and like resonant structures. So like lots of people, despite the fact that, you know, they know somehow that culturally this is not right, or there are all kinds of like weird connections, but nevertheless there is this appeal. And I feel like in Lykourgos' work you can totally understand this appeal, because they are like always so kind of beautiful and funny and exciting, and I feel like he's reflecting that kind of structure, at least to my eyes, of this appeal of the batshit conspiracy kind of theories, and how basically we, by kind of focusing on factuality, you know, and you see that in liberal media, for example, they're like, but how can people believe in QAnon? This is complete bullshit. Like, how can they believe that we are run by reptilians? Like, this is, you know, inconceivable. Nevertheless, if you're actually kind of get into this rabbit hole and start watching all the YouTube videos and you know, all the memes produced by the right-wing people, you start like understanding that there is some sort of like enjoyment that is like completely unhinged and very kind of like there is some sort of like allure there that is like hard to conceptualize, or kind of exactly if you try to conceptualize, I guess you enter this space of psychoanalysis that's really exciting for this conference and this video showcase in particular.
Foivos, I wonder if we could then think about centrism as something that has evacuated the pleasure out of knowledge. Like, because I was thinking about that, because it just seems like these appeals to facts are so lame, and they really, you know, like the pleasure of knowledge, I mean, is like this pleasure of like finding things out or discovering, you know, and Freud associates it with sexuality. You're looking underneath things or below things or around things where you're not supposed to look. And it feels to me as if the idea is like, no, we have the facts, the truth is out there, it is established. Well, the truth is out there is also like X-Files, so that's like another, but you know, the truth is right here.
No, it's
you know, don't look for it. It takes the pleasure out completely of knowledge.
Yeah, you know, like with Brexit, for example, you would have like Daily Mail and the tabloids being like having a front page that was like, the EU wants to control the size of our cucumbers, and it would have like a huge cucumber on the front page, and the next day the European Union would issue like, the European Union is not interested in regulating the sizes of vegetables in the European Economic Zone. And he's like, that's not the point. You know,
well, it also creates, like, when you have to deny something like that, it almost reinforces the idea that there's something there to deny. Like, if I say, well, we are definitely not going to regulate cucumber size, it's like, why did you say that? Like, you're definitely going to do it, you know?
So like the response of like Lykourgos, an artist who work with this kind of affirmative, would be like the European Union issuing a very specific like weird shaped like cucumber and be like, this is the cucumber from now on, and no one is allowed to consume anything else like that is not shaped like that. Yeah, I don't know how our work translates into policy making.
I think it's great that the cucumbers will take that shape.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole concept of connectivity that was mentioned before, I mean, this is art has been doing that for a very long time. Whether you're doing films or whatever, paintings or, you know, anything, poetry, it's all about connecting things. So the art of putting one thing next to another thing, this is something that, you know, this is something that artists do. Now, whether you're putting one thing next to another thing that claims that those two things are meant to be together because they have some kind of political linearity, that's a different story. But and that's, I think, when it gets kind of complicated with what art claims to be. But the fact that a lot of the enjoyment from creativity and art comes from putting things together, things that might not have been, that no one might have thought about putting together, like, you know, a Greek pop musician from the 60s, you know, and Vietnam's communist history. That's what actually produces work. So the next question, I think the question becomes more complicated when you dare to claim that this is actually what happened. I think maybe what we're seeing is that the more politics seem to be not making so much actual sense, maybe the more the audiences expect that art would make more actual linear sense, something like this, like that artists are now asked to answer the questions of the absurdity of contemporary politics, something like this.
I would like to respond to that with some kind of a provocation and ask, okay, connectivity, but what are we connecting? Are we just connecting ideas? Because what I would say is that, especially in the case of conspiracy theories, we're connecting between people. And we are giving people a sense of community. And in the backdrop, you can see a video by a community called Desperately Seeking. It's an online community of concerned millennials invested in topics of digital wellness. This is one of my projects, but basically it's a fake community. We claim that we have 3,000 followers. Each time we hold a panel or some kind of a video Zoom, we read comments from our fake chats. We have an entire elaborate history that we constantly introduce. Now, I'm bringing this project up because one of the panels that we did in our weekly Zoom sessions we called back then Zoom Shake the Room, was about conspiracy theories, in which the founder of the community claimed that there are now factions within Desperately Seeking, within the wellness communities, who are prone to conspiracy theories, and that she's very concerned about what is happening. So we basically made a fake conspiracy theory about conspiracy theories. And then we theorized that, and we also started talking about, for instance, the Flat Earth Society. And that's a very nice example of how this connectivity brought people together. And what we found out is that basically, I guess what these ideas connect is people who don't want to feel excluded, who feel alone. And finally, there's someone out there who believes or wants to believe in this idea of mine, as preposterous as it may be, right? So again, what I think we're seeing towards the coming election, 4 years after post-truth has become a thing, 4 years after fake news have become a thing, 4 years after we've internalized these things as methodologies, is that people are already using these things, not in order to figure out what is true or not true, but to function, to socialize, to not feel alone in a world in which we all feel isolated, right? So we are using artistic methodologies, quote unquote, in a much more complex, elaborate way than we used to. This is what I mean, that this is no longer the terrain of artists alone. And this is what is also so scary. So if you say it is the role of art now to, you know, make these connections and force politics to react to that, I would say yes, but it's not artists necessarily who are using these artistic methodologies. We're using them just to cope,
I wonder, Gabriel, if that then introduces the question of like the evacuation of the public, which is something I'm going to talk about on my panel, because it sounds to me like what you're saying functionally is that people are constructing almost like these publics in like in private frequently spaces, or in slightly privatized spaces or ways that are encroached upon, because there's no real space within you know, the so-called public sphere. Like there is no, you know, like the public sphere has essentially been evacuated. And the same is true for like a lot of art, like you know, when we say public art now, it, you know, it has a particular meaning, and we understand the limitations of what that really means. Either it's extremely vapid and produced, you know, by government to like tidy up an ugly side of a building or something, or it may be ostensibly public, but what it really is you know, funded by extraordinary chains of private profit, which is just essentially for, you know, tax purposes being considered public or being exposed to the public. So this sort of public aspect of art, the idea that art could be something that equalizes people, that mediates between people, that carries meaning between people in terms of like a relationship between producers and their audience and so on, seems to have been more and more neoliberalized. You know, there's an interesting sequence from the Post-45 series. Yale has this journal called Post-45, and they had this recent thing called it was the 8. How many arts are there, Greeks? How many are there? 9, 8, 7?
9.
9. Okay, yeah, it was like the 9 neoliberal arts. And I thought that was like really interesting, because what they argued is that what neoliberal art does more than any other kind of art is it creates a kind of hierarchy between the producer of the content, who then becomes like a figure, like a cathected figure, and then the consumers of the content. And so when you're producing art as a neoliberal artist, you're producing not just the art, but you're also producing a sense of selfhood and like a figure to collect an audience around. But what that actually does is it destroys what Gabriel was talking about. It destroys the sense of community. And well, or it can, I mean, there's still a sense of community, but it's extremely hierarchical, and it's not as participatory.
You know, with BTS, for example, and K-pop, you see that like it's super hierarchical, but the consumers, they also have their own internal politics that are separated to the art. I don't know. Sorry. Destroying this.
No, you're right. I think there is something to say about then the communities almost like detach and create their own publics around that pole. But for the artist, it like themselves, what you end up with is like a complete detachment from the public functionally, usually, if you're trying to create that relationship.
Yeah.
I would maybe quickly respond to this question of the evacuation of the public, that from at least more technological position, I would say that, well, it has been the social performances or the performances of socializing have been automated. And that, I think, is what is creating this feeling of this vapid, vacant society, because in order to socialize today, you just swipe right. And so maybe these artistic practices, and humor me for a second, for the sake of the argument, forming a community like the Flat Earth Society was created by certain artistic practices to some extent, is sort of a response to this automation. It's kind of like a more grassroots, authentic way of socializing. it answers a need. And I understand where that need comes from.
I'm just thinking with there would presumably be some kind of substantiation of that in the apparent success of conspiracy theories during lockdown, during various lockdowns, and the accelerated spread. That would fit quite well. There's a question I've kind of been wanting to ask throughout, because I think it's there in a lot of what I've seen, which is very limited, and I can't emphasize that enough, of all the work produced by all of you here, is the performative lecture, or a variation on those terms in whatever way. And it just struck me as, I mean, at several points during the last 45 minutes or so of what we've been discussing, it's kind of come to mind. And I just, obviously, you put the word lecture next to notions of truth and authority and knowledge, and you've got something going on there. But I wonder whether, I mean, obviously, as an art form, it's been around for a long time and way precedes our current moment. But I would have recognised that perhaps a wider turn towards it, or return towards it. And what does it offer from the perspective of a practitioner, and what desires and anxieties, because we're talking about psychoanalysis, does it encode, or does it store?
Yeah. Who wants to? Can I go? For me, like this format of the performative lecture is obviously something we're very interested in as FYTA, our art duo with Phil, and also in terms of what we curate. And what I really like is about, when we talk about all these topics like post-truth and postmodernism, or whatever, all these kind of theories that in their heart they have this notion that there are contradictory forces in every narrative, for example, or every kind of subjectivity. But what I really hate is when people talk about the enjoyment of speech and the contradiction of discourse, and they present it in the most kind of like, cliche academic discourse, and there is nothing performative, there is nothing contradictory, there is nothing there is no kind of sense of enjoyment. And I'm like, what the, academia has been talking about these things, since the 70s. And like, you would expect people would understand that it's not just the content, but it's also the form, and how we present these theories and how we kind of embody these theories that is important. And yeah, I mean, if you see videos of Lacan, for example, presenting his ideas, he's aware that he needs to also kind of perform. He needs to be a clown, because his ideas basically mock knowledge production, and at the same time he occupies the position of the truth speaker. So he's aware that there is a contradiction there, and that's very often lost in academia. And I feel like academia right now, with all these years of theorizing, post-structuralism and all these things, they would be really well kind of positioned to talk about post-truth now. And they don't have to say much, actually, or what they say is irrelevant, or no one wants to listen to what they say. So I was thinking that that's really important to problematize that and try to make something. And actually, initially, we wanted this conference to be in the physical space and have all kinds of disruptions and all kinds of performances intersecting with the lectures. And we, if all goes well, we might have that opportunity next year. That's my response.
And the thing you mentioned about the performative lecture, one would hope that when lectures take place in a fine art context and not in a university, they would be maybe more aware of themselves, of their performativity, but often they're worse. Actually, they're worse because frequently artists have this kind of anxiety to perform as academics, and they become the most stiff lecturers of all in the end. So you're thinking, wait a minute, that can't be right. Like your work, it has to do with performance, and your lecture is about truth and post-truth, and you're putting all this together in the most grand narrative, strict academic way you could do. What's going on here? So that's another reason, I think, why we're particularly interested in the performative lecture aspect, because both my and Foivos' background were maybe a little bit more from, let's say, academic slash Foivos' psychoanalysis. Mine was more cultural studies kind of background rather than strict fine arts. So when we started having a relationship with the fine art world, the political side of it, we were really hoping that the people who would claim that they're interested in the arts and politics would be really performative in the way that they present their things. And when we saw that this wasn't the case at all, we were like, we started really trying to find the people who actually do that. And I have to say, we were delighted when we discovered Gabriel's In Defense of the Academic Troll thing, because we were like, oh my God, this actually answers a lot of our questions and anxieties. And it wasn't like in our heads that there is an inherent issue there. I mean, I'm going to say something which I don't know, maybe it's just about touches on the not so correct, but I'll say it anyway. I cannot believe that there are not enough analysis. There is not, or is there any analysis about Zizek, correlating Zizek's theories and the way he talks? Because for me, this is actually, you cannot take them apart. I mean, I can imagine that the way he writes is the way he talks. So, someone has to take this apart and look at this kind of, not just the performance, but also, the way the way he kind of goes back and forth and the hand movements and everything. And I'm thinking, wait a second, how does everybody just takes this as if it was written by some kind of, sort of straight-facing academic robot? It's not the case at all. So I think definitely there's something there in terms of in this notion of the performative lecture and relating to truth, but also pleasure and so on. But it's very untouched. And if academia doesn't touch it, I wouldn't say the arts touch it that much either.
And it doesn't have to be necessarily pleasure in the sense of spectacle. It can also be like awkwardness and like, using negative emotions and like drag, but just thematizing the fact that you are on top of this, place and you're talking to an audience about truth. I don't know.
I think I have personally seen, I've personally understood more things about the world from this project with the drunken lecturers than about any fine art conferences I've been to.
Good. Hopefully our conference, Phil, satisfies your very high standards.
We'll see.
If no one else would like to comment, I could jump in, but I feel like I'd like to give a fair share of the time. But otherwise, okay, so just one comment. I actually think I love spectacle. I think it's time to reclaim the spectacle. There's been a lot of very enticing academic writing recently about well, very negative bias that is formed around the concept of the spectacle because of Guy Debord, he has a very limited version and definition of spectacle, whereas in other languages, it's not necessarily that negative. And I think this is also a great way to approach and to examine the formation of knowledge as a form of spectacle. Actually, if academia admitted that it is invested in the spectacle that it is rejecting at one and the same time, we would be in a much better place right now.
Absolutely.
Because we would be immune as academics, I for one, I guess, sort of, we would be immune to anti-intellectual attacks that blame academia for being aloof, right? Because again, it is not acknowledging its own performativity and its own investment in the spectacle. So that's one comment. About the lecture performance as a form, I think that right now is a wonderful moment, actually, on the double-edged sword of where we stand. You talked about very dry lectures by artists inside of academia because they need to show how academic they are. They need to prove something. But on the other side, I'm seeing, because of COVID-19, because of this crisis of representation of knowledge, because suddenly we don't have podiums and we have these, you know, book cases in our backdrop to show how much we know, right? So a lot of public speakers with an academic background are stepping up and accepting the challenge. And there's a wonderful, wonderful example that I recall and constantly referred to by Naomi Klein. She gave a talk, it was on Skype, about, it was coronavirus politics and how to beat it, or how to beat them. And she's talking about the new abnormal and how nothing has been normal, and that this crisis only brings that to the fore. And then in the middle of this Skype talk, she introduces her son, who just comes in, and she stops everything, introduces her son to the public, which is probably a couple thousand people. And she said, oh yeah, for instance, here's an example of not abnormal situation. I'm doing this from my living room. And then she introduces Smoke, the dog, who jumps on her lap. And they all say hi to the camera, and she just exposes the whole mechanism and the whole performativity that she is right now working with in order to give this talk. And every now and then, and I think this is also a classic Zizek kind of approach, right? To use the academic style on one hand and be very, very clear in what you're saying, and then crack a joke, and then tear down the third wall in this case, because this is a video, it's not 3D. And I think this is something that we're now seeing more and more, because public speakers have no other alternative but to become creative with this very limited setting. They cannot fall back on this prestigious framing, the conference hall. They're not raised from the public with a stage, and there's no podium. And I do see this. I do see this more. It is a question where or not academia will learn the lesson, so to speak. But there, if anything, I would hope that the performance, that artists do, I'm less interested in lecture performances by artists today and much more interested in how other disciplines in academia adopt this. And I think they don't have a choice. We need to give Zoom classes. We need to give enticing classes to students who would either otherwise just turn off their camera and make believe as if they're there while they're doing something else. So we better learn something from lecture performance, from the arts. That's the only way, I think, for academia to survive.
Yeah,
Aimée or Lykourgos, do you want to come in on that?
I'm used to participate in panels and lectures in a more performative way, and at this moment I don't, so it doesn't feel so comfortable. What should I comment on that? I don't know. Kind of agree, like that there is like being in a lot of art lectures, most of the times, yeah, they end up being boring, despite the fact that the work of the artist is extremely performative and extremely something else than they present. But I realized, to be honest, that in academia there are much more performativity in the lectures. So I absolutely prefer to go to academic lectures rather than art lectures. That's my comment.
But Lykourgos, in terms of like the whole idea of the spectacle and you know, not doing the obvious, I think there is something interesting in the art scene, like with artists being really afraid to be like very, I don't know, very obvious, very populist, very pop in general. And I feel like your work, both as pop tectonism and your like more kind of as the work you present as Lykourgos Porfyris, I feel like it's always kind of not afraid to do this kind of stuff. And I feel like for me, you are one of the most interesting artists, like from Athens, obviously. And I always find this so weird, like when we go to like other like art shows and we see this like fear of the spectacle, the fear of the obvious, the fear of like that people will understand that your thoughts are not super deep. I don't know if you have some comment on that, because I feel like that's an interesting thread that Aimée touched upon earlier on with like, you know, presenting work that's kind of pop or is not like crafty in the traditional kind of disciplinary ways.
Yeah, maybe that has to do maybe like with a sort of a prone behavior and exposing uncomfortableness, which is a main sort of target in my work and mostly in pop tectonism, though, like to expose the uncomfortableness of being on stage and do the most like losing like the rhythm and all this, and not in purpose, like yeah, not exactly on purpose, yeah. So that is a part of the practice, and also in the lectures. And yeah, when it becomes obvious, I really don't feel comfortable with being confident on doing something.
One of the reasons why I asked about it as a form was kind of prompted when, Gabriel, you were talking about people's need to connect, and instead of connecting ideas, connecting people through conspiracy theories, and that a kind of need for intimacy or whatever it is that provides. And there was something about the address and what the kind of address that is facilitated by a performative lecture. Has a distinction here between, you know, it being a lecture being performed in real life in a very performative way, and, for example, how a lecture might be performed to university students via a Zoom platform, but via an academics or an artist's domestic setting. There's something obviously very, very different about that, which has been pointed out. But I wonder, in the latter setting, the word that comes to mind is a certain, which I think is a problem, and that's why I'm kind of trying to articulate this, some kind of notion of authenticity, or a kind of direct address that is some kind of intimate in some way. And that, for me at least, I can't help but feeling a little suspicious of the of what is being performed there, because I don't think that, I mean, obviously when an academic is lecturing on a dais, on a stage with a university behind them or whatever, they're performing the academy and that type of knowledge. Whatever they're doing, however they're doing it, it is in some ways a performance of that. when you're sitting in your living room, no matter what you're talking about, you're also performing something else. And this isn't going to end in a question or a prompt, but I just thought it was worth vocalizing the various ways in which performance hides itself, and all the things that it performs whilst not wanting to, how it betrays itself. Perhaps is a better way of putting it.
I mean, that reminds me of the was Jeffrey Toobin Dick incident on Zoom. Made me think about this. I don't know if
Can you let us know, because it's not familiar to me, certainly.
Okay, so in the U.S., he's like one of the, believe he's one of the editors at the New Yorker. He's a columnist for the New Yorker. He's like a legal expert. He recently got in trouble, and he's a contributor at CNN as well. Jeffrey Toobin, he got in trouble because he was essentially caught jerking off on a Zoom call where they were, and by caught, I mean he clearly showed that on the camera. The one thing that really made me aware of is that even though we may feel like we're kind of engaging in a less repressed form of exchange, which we are in some ways, I suppose, with the Zoom calls, there's many things that we're constantly not showing, as evidenced by this rather flagrant violation of that. It was really funny though, because he said in response, it was so amazing, he goes, "I thought my camera was on mute." Which I just love that so much. But I thought it was a really good example of psychoanalysis, right? Because the question to ask in that situation isn't, why is this man masturbating? Why is this dick out, etc. The question is, why didn't he think to check twice, to turn the camera off or whatever? And that reveals so much more about who he might be as a person, what's going on psychologically. He might have felt an unconscious need to confess something or show something, or to get in trouble, but I guess I say that to just suggest that I think you're right, Ivan, that there's different kind of repressive expectations for different genres of, I mean, but that I guess the question of what the performance lecture is, or whether, I think there's another question, which is does the performance lecture have to be historicized as well? Which is, because I know when I went to Athens and we did some talks, myself and some other American speakers would our instinct was to just grab the microphone and get into the audience and have this much more dialogic relationship with the audience, whereas some of the European speakers wanted to sit at the table or the podium or whatever. And I think that has a lot to do with the ways in which the American academic tradition, from Emerson's The American Scholar onward, is a tradition that's a much more oral tradition. It bases a lot of intellectual production in orature. The figures that it uses are almost all figures of live speaking rather than writing, or literacy. And so I think the question of whether I've stayed away from the genre of the performance lecture because I don't feel like I adequately perform the dry academic lecture. So I think maybe that comes back into the question of intentionality. Is it the same thing if I try to do a normal academic lecture and just fail, as it is if somebody else feels like they can really create a performance lecture that kind of adequately deconstructs the genre? And if so, or is there some kind of because Lykourgos, you said something too, where it's I'm not doing it on purpose, some of these mistakes or failures. I mean, I feel like that's what's really salient to me. And it's also with Leaky, why did I choose to kind of do translations in languages where I'm absolutely not fluent, at all, whatsoever? Why even try to do something like that when you feel in artistic terms, surely that's a failure. So I suppose that brings it back to the question of intentionality again.
Well, I think it does absolutely, and it's interesting the examples that you give. One, when you said I thought my camera was on mute, it's the camera's off and the speaker's on mute. So it's the parapraxis is there, and then also when you're talking about translating from language to other, that you're going to trip. Language is going to always trip you up, and for sure that's you couldn't get more psychoanalytic than that in terms of intentionality. I feel that I've spoken way too much, so I was just going to ask if there are any more questions that people wanted to raise or ask to a particular person. There's always a silence when someone asks a question like that, but I'm sure we can get through it.
I might have one, which is about cancel culture and about this question of like whether art has to have like a really, really clear meaning, and whether there's like a danger now being sensed from ambiguity. And Phil and Foivos brought this up quite a lot. I guess I have intuitions about why that is the case, which has everything to do with the fact that the publics feel like they're not functioning, as we kind of talked about. Is there like any other reason that you feel the desire for like a clear meaning has emerged relative to art? And like, do you feel like there's any way that art can respond to that? Is there like any positive way that we can respond to that demand for like a clear social, moral, factual meaning? Sorry.
Difficult question.
It's okay to just say no.
I mean, it's difficult to do that, because as in what? Like, just say, okay, let's just pretend that post-structuralism never happened and let's start again. Is it possible to do that? And does it make sense to do that? And what can you gain from that? Or is it about, I mean, for example, in Lykourgos' work, but also our work, sometimes journalists would approach Lykourgos, or we've discussed this a lot, or us to be featured somewhere, but they wanted to make sure that our final meaning is that we are actually left-wing. Otherwise, they wouldn't feature it. Like, can you know, yes, we understand why you do that, but ultimately you think that the left is right, right? You know, it was, oh, and I just said right. Yeah, they wanted to make sure that there is definitely not a chance that they might be featuring an actual fascist in their, you know, in their, I don't know, article or whatever. So the moment that they were afraid that something like this would happen, they would not be interested. And any times we didn't offer this kind of security, and maybe Lykourgos can also talk about his experience, but anytime we would not offer this kind of ultimate security, secure reading, they would not be interested. I don't know why. Is this new? Is it new? Is it that it's just now that it's like this? Does it mean that art is expected to be left-wing? Does it mean that the only art that can exist is the art that is for the greater good? I mean, one of my favorite phrases is, which of course relates to spectacle, is from Leibach, who say art and totalitarianism are not mutually exclusive. You know, who is to say that that art is meant to be moral?
Mhm.
I sound totally like this LD5 people. I don't know what they were they called. This is so, you know, I just want to.
No, they would say it's like all about freedom, no? Like they wouldn't say that thing you just said about totalitarianism.
Yeah, that's true.
I guess.
That's an important difference.
They have like a quite romantic view of art.
Exactly.
I guess.
The kind of idea that freedom is the most important value of art.
But arguably that's like more compatible with what people want in theory that's what they do want art to signify. And so I think that's a really difficult problem. It's like the fascists were the ones producing art along the lines of romantic freedom.
But we are reaching our limits with this approach also. Like, it's not like we are confident in this approach of like ambiguity. Because, for example, like, I don't know, there are many examples from our work in the past few years. But for example, we hosted this performance in the previous event in Athens, where the performer was saying basically that if you consume German blood, is good for you because German blood has all these health properties. And he took some blood from his hand and put it in the microscope, and they were like small swastikas made of blood vessels, like blood cells. And then he put his blood on top of ice cream, offered it to the audience. And many people like left that performance thinking that this was a scientific presentation. And there were like articles on Greek press saying that this German scientist said that German blood is good for the health, and how could they allow that in the School of Fine Arts? And it was like, I don't know, I found this whole thing, on one hand, it's like, you know, it's funny and interesting and like opens up this space for a conversation. On the other hand, I'm like, and like, what is the end game? Like, you know, like, people starting drinking German blood, like, you know, when do you like, you know, what is the politics in the end of the day, like, because, you know, we live in times where like people are quite, I don't know, open to the conspiratorial.
Maybe a word on post-structuralism, art, and ethics. Because I think there's a great difference between demanding that art be ethical, which I personally would reject this demand, then the difference between that and expecting art to deal with ethics and, you know, the limits of ethics and how ethics is or are formed. And I think what we're seeing right now is, again, assuming, I think what is happening more and more is that post-structuralism and post-structuralist methodologies are adopted by people who are not necessarily artists. And I'm looking at internet influencers, for instance. I like saying that half of the videos by internet influencers are about how to make internet influencer videos. And they constantly tear down the third wall. And then they buy their views and they buy their likes and they buy their followers. And then they buy another batch of followers to make it seem as if the buying of the followers in the first place had a following. And then they talk about that as well. So to some extent, they do practice these artistic methodologies, which stretch the line of, or obfuscate the border, the ethical border. And so since everyone else is doing it and using these, at the time, artistic methodologies, what is art left to do if not discuss the dynamics of ethics? I mean, if you take that away from art, what what can we contribute at this point? I mean, everyone else is already doing it. So I'm very, very uncomfortable when people start demanding art be more this or more that in terms of ethics. Definitely.
On the other hand, there is this choice, for an example, because I have had this problem, let's say, with the institutions, that the institutions, not so much with press, but mostly with institutions, that they want to clarify that this project is fake, or this project is commenting on this rather than presenting it as a real project. And I think that also if an institution is choosing to put a work there, then they can be characterized of accepting a right-wing agenda, right?
Mm. Yeah.
So the problematic is there, like that these people have given voice to extreme right-wing. Well, in my case, I'm not so much risking, but maybe older days, but yeah, I think that I kind of understand that someone don't want to be characterized as a Nazi-friendly person. Or
Yeah, but at the same time, like looking at your work, like, you know, the elements of humor and the elements of like, it's not like so fascistic that you wouldn't be able to tell if you didn't make a
yeah.
which is, I think, also an important distinction to the work produced by Laibach, for example. Like, I feel like that's also important to take into consideration, that the text itself, the work itself, it's often offers some sort, like when Richard put the little swastikas in his blood, for example, I feel like, you know, he gave away that this is not the real scientific like research, like you know, this kind of stuff.
Yeah, but then you get people like Milo Yiannopoulos, and the line is really blurred, because similarly to Lykourgos, his work is queer and his work is funny and blah blah. So
Yeah, but in the case of Milo, I think that I love the Milo moment because it exposed the problem of academia to even understand a character such as Milo Yiannopoulos. I think he was a wonderful provocateur. Sorry for saying this, because he really showed us what the limits of the discourse are and where we are most uncomfortable. And the problem academia had at that moment was to have the conversation with Milo, not Milo himself. And if academia was a bit more skilled in acknowledging its own aesthetic and its own, again, performativity, I wouldn't say that would be a non-issue, but it would be a lot less awkward.
But Gabriel, also, like Milo being expelled by the alt-right in a way, it's also indicative of the limits of what we think as this postmodern right-wing politics, right? Because they were not able to basically contain this much of contradiction. Like he eventually became a minor and kind of ostracized figure when he played with pedophilia, for example. So to me, that's also interesting to see that what we sometimes kind of construct as this like really kind of postmodern right is also not.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Foivos, I think you're right. I think that one thing to say about the right wing, I mean, and I gave a talk again at this same event in Athens on like right wing masculinity and how, well, not on masculinity, but on right wing male groups and how they do or don't decide whether it's okay to be gay or it's okay to like have women in your group or whatever, which is like, these are like really fraught for them decisions. And it's quite interesting to look at like the ways in which, for example, if you decide you can have gay men in your group, it's because you think of like the classical Greek tradition as being like part of the West, or, you know, it's quite funny like to see what the way that they put that together. But I think, yeah, they are willing to weaponize all kinds of things, but if you look at the way the right wing actually has to navigate those questions themselves of like meaning with their own audience and their own membership, in the case of like organized, you know, right wing groups, or I think it is complicated. Like they, I don't think they're quite as permissive. You know, if the idea is that the left is like intolerant, the right obviously is also extremely intolerant, but just in, you know, they have found different ways, I think, of navigating those boundaries. But again, like on the micro level, they really haven't. Like, there's lots and lots of ways in which right-wing events will get trolled by other right-wingers, or there'll be like a lot of problems there.
I also think it's important to remember that the right wing is not as monolithic as we would like to imagine it. There are various strands and factions, and if I recall correctly, I think it was the Daily Stormer, or it was people, the more neo-Nazi, blatantly right-wing fascist groups never liked the fact that they were represented by Milo. This is just something that Milo took on himself as part of Breitbart to kind of like, you know, make a name for himself. So whereas someone like Steve Bannon really enjoyed Milo because it was a great PR move on his account, they never sided with that, right? So I think, again, this is this political identity kind of conflict between right and left. We always tend to generalize this other group as this general they, but it's a lot more complicated than that. We need to give credit to the idea that this is a spectral political map at the end of the day, and it's a lot more diverse. So just to clarify that.
I do think that it's worth questioning what the right wing, like what some of maybe the right wing theories or philosophies of art are, though, and whether they're compatible or incompatible with neoliberal ideas of art. Because in some ways, kind of as we talked about, I think that a lot of neoliberal ideas of what art does are compatible with right-wing ideas of art. I think that obviously in practice, this breaks down. A lot of the art produced by right-wingers is not palatable in terms of like the way it actually manifests itself and the way it expresses those ideas. But if you look at like what it's supposed to do, you know, the ideas of like, you know, beauty and truth and freedom and so on, that you know, somebody like LD50 or whatever would be expressing, I think are like quite compatible in a lot of ways with ideas of what like the arts and humanities are supposed to bring to culture and society. And I think you see the gallery, like the gallery has to then take on this like self-reflexive, you know, critical view of like, no, we're the opposite of that. Maybe like we have this like very clear self-critique potentially to kind of distinguish themselves from that. I'm not sure. I mean, this is getting into like extremely speculative territory about institutions and the way that they think and position themselves. But I do feel there's like a right-wing ideology of what art does, and that's really troubling.
On that positive note, I think we're running out of time. So I don't know. Ivan has any concluding remarks, or
no, I haven't. Maybe I should have jotted some down, but I would just like to thank you and for the invitation to join the discussion, and thank everyone else for contributing so much.
Thank you again also for hosting this panel. I thought that it was a very, very important contribution to the program to also allow us as artists to speak and not just to showcase. It was a fascinating conversation for me. I felt very much at home. So thank everyone also who participated, really.
Let's hope that we will be able to, you know, to host another event and see you all in person as well soon.
That would be lovely.
Okay.